Welcome to the Bringing Up Business podcast, where we talk about business and parenting. I'm your host, Kaila Sachse. I am raising a toddler, and I also run a design and marketing agency called Umari Digital. I'm excited to chat with today's guest, Renee Rubens. She is the founder and tea event experience producer of Symphony of Leaves Tea Company. Throughout her distinguished career in global and national media sales, she cultivated a tradition of presenting finely crafted teas and bespoke teas as gifts for clients during holidays and special occasions. This practice ultimately inspired the vision for a dedicated venture. Guided by a commitment to responsible sourcing, ethical harvesting, and equitable trade practices, she established Symphony of Leaves Tea Co. as a small business during the height of COVID. Symphony of Leaves not only survived the pandemic, it has thrived, and we'll dig into what Renee has been doing to attribute to that success. Renee, I'm so excited to have you here on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to just kind of talking about my experiences and, working in corporate America and then pivoting to being a small business owner, and what it was like parenting during being in corporate America too. So
Oh my goodness, tell us all about that. Let's start with your journey in corporate America when you had your kids. What was that like?
yeah, I was young when I had my oldest daughter. I was 22, right? So just finished school and had my daughter. So we kind of, and I always joke that we grew up together, right? Because there are things that at 22 you kind of know some stuff, but there are a lot of things that you just kind of don't really know. But it worked out well, so she's a great kid. But I wasn't, it probably wasn't until I was in my mid to late 20s that I was really sure on the path of what my career was going to look like. So I was in media sales, and um, it was from the start, and I always say this to people, if it was really a fun job, right? Being in media sales was just really interesting. And especially because I had, after a few years of doing it, really realized that I wanted to focus on the B2B space. So I got to work with a lot of really smart people, and delve into what their businesses were like, where their pain points were, and be able to use a lot of my creativity as well as the resources of the publishing company that I worked for to be able to help companies um, have solutions that were helping them with close whatever communications gaps that were there. So, by way of having to work at a job, I was always really blessed to have a really cool job, right? And I think though, because now I have three daughters, right? I think that the way that I learned to work has really been instrumental in how they are now professionals. My oldest daughter, like I said, I was young, so she actually just turned 40 recently. So, and her career is doing really well. And my next daughter is 31 and 26, and they also have really good work ethic and very focused on. I think they do a better job than we did when we were younger, right? They're really good at life work balance. They totally embrace that thinking, right? It's a different generation than when I was younger. My generation was like you just work, 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 and you keep working, right? And you always had to get it done. And there was recognition and reward for putting in more hours. Whereas
Mhm.
their generation is like, no, I've got a life, and they have clear boundaries that they're not afraid to advocate for. So that was different.
Yeah. Do you think for you, if you could go back in time and reinstate any boundaries to help you better contain your work life versus your personal life, raising your girls, what boundaries would you have instilled?
Yeah, I would have definitely put some more boundaries about around how many hours you put in at work, right? What we've learned is the work is always going to be there, right? And and your children are not going to be young forever, right? So you do get to, you get the opportunity. I mean, I can think about, unfortunately, times, especially because I traveled a lot, that I missed a lot of events, right? I would sometimes be rushing to, from an airport to try to get home in time, and I'd be in the back of a schoolroom where they were having an event, but I would just be making it by the skin of my teeth, right? And then sometimes, you have a flight delay and you don't get there. I had wonderful support. My parents were amazing. I was, divorced after a while. I did have a nanny, so she was tremendously helpful. So I'm very thankful that I had a really great support network. But if I could do anything over, it would probably be to be able to say, no, I can't make this trip, or I need to be home by a certain hour. So that's it.
Yeah. And it can be so hard to say no to potential opportunities, especially when you're climbing the career ladder and you're trying to hunt the next big goalpost, or if you're self-employed and you're looking for the next client, you want to say yes to everything, right? And it's really hard to not sink into a mindset of scarcity.
Right. I'm so glad you said that, because I think that's what it is, right? There's some fears that you have that you might miss out on something. But the reality is there will be another opportunity. Another opportunity will come along. And, especially because we're in sales, the way I think that you need to look at the relationships that you have with your clients is that this is a partnership. They recognize that you're human. They have lives also, and you just need to be candid and say, okay, I can make this work, because they know how important they are to you. But you also have to just be honest and say, but I can't do this time, right? I've got to do X, I've got to be back home, or I've got to be in another city, or whatever I need to do. But I do think that it's okay for you to say, this doesn't work for me, or this scenario, the situation doesn't work the way I need it to work. And it doesn't mean that your work output or your work product will be diminished. It just means that you can't be there, right? Because again, think about it, this is, 35 years ago, we didn't have the kind of technology we have now, right? So you didn't have the option of getting on a Zoom. There was no Zoom, right? There was an in-person experience, and and don't get, please, let me make sure I'm clear, because in-person experiences really help cultivate the relationships, and they make the relationships stronger, I believe. But there's sometimes you do have to be able to put some boundaries on it that say, um, you can trust me that I'm going to deliver what needs to be delivered, but at this time I need to be able to not be present, and maybe figure out another way to communicate.
Yeah, yeah, that absolutely resonates. Coming from a time where, yes, everything was in person, or if not in person, over the phone, where you couldn't have that face to face.
Right.
The technology has shifted, right? Now we can hop on Zoom. We can check our emails 24/7. We can text whenever. Although I don't recommend texting clients unless you have that kind of relationship.
No, you probably shouldn't text your client. And you also need to be mindful that you should not be texting people whenever. One of the things I learned, especially when I was doing a lot of work in Europe, um, the French and the Spanish are serious about their downtime, and
Mm.
you are not. You are not. It is definitely frowned upon if you're sending messages at 8, 9, 10 o'clock in the evening. That is not a win. You're not looked upon as, as somebody who in the States that may be seen as, you're really dedicated, you're going the extra mile, you're really doing your job. There they see it as an intrusion, right? You are intruding
Interesting.
upon their time. And when I started doing that work, I realized, right, and this is probably one of the most valuable lessons I've learned in work, which I've been able to take to life. You have to look at your lens, look at other people through their lens, not only your own lens, right? So, like I said, in this country, it is well recognized, it's well received if you're sending out messages, because it looks like you're working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, and people applaud you for that, right? That's not when you look at, when you're someplace else, when you're in France, or in Spain, or wherever, right? They're not necessarily looking at you through the same lens that you're looking at this scenario. They are looking at you definitely as if this needs to stop, because it's not an emergency, right? At the end of the day, it's advertising, so it's never an emergency. You're not performing surgery. It may be important. It may be important, and every once in a while, especially back in the days when we were doing print, you had some deadlines. But again, it was never going to be rocket science, and you weren't saving a life, right? But part of that also comes with aging, right? Or maturing, I will say. And as you
Mhm.
gain some more wisdom, you're like, okay, it's important. Here's how we frame it, and this is what it looks like. But you definitely, I think, in professional settings and certainly in work, I learned more about looking through somebody else's lens and kind of making decisions like that.
Yeah. That is all something that I have been learning, and I'm so grateful to be starting to grasp, especially as a parent. I feel like that introduction into motherhood, because I was a freelancer for a long time, and then I started my agency, and right around the same time that's when I found out I was pregnant. And so I was learning how to build up this agency at the same time as becoming a mother. It was really overwhelming. Got through it, as we seem to do, right? As a parent, you just kind of figure it out. We don't
Hey,
have
good for you. Yep, you'll figure it
Yeah,
out.
just figure it out. And I noticed a huge shift in how I respected my time and how I treated my time. I started to realize that time is a finite resource. You don't just have all the time in the world. You don't get to just stay up whenever you want to stay up, because now you have to think about sleep and how that affects your mood and your energy levels the next day. You have to have very firm on off boundaries so that you can spend time with your kids, and if you have a partner, with your partner. It seems to be a deeper topic than what you realize before becoming a
A-
parent.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that there's certain things that you take for granted, and then I think as you mature, you do not only realize but accept and navigate the space of there are only 24 hours a day, and there's nothing that says you need to be fully engaged in work or fully engaged in anything for 16 of those hours, right? There's this time when you deserve to give yourself the grace, and part of that grace, right, part of that time, I believe in self-care, right? But it took me a long time to get there, right? And you have to give yourself to your self-care, because if you don't, then when those other people who are really reliant upon you, or when you want to be able to make a contribution, you may not be able to deliver the way you need to deliver, simply because you have not really respected yourself enough to kind of appreciate that rest is a part of this journey, right? You cannot function without the proper amount of rest, or the proper amount of downtime, or the proper amount of time just having fun, right? Or doing things that bring you joy. So, um, joy and rest are joy and rest are absolutely essential parts of this journey that we're taking in life. And if you don't take it seriously, the end results may not be always in your favor.
100%. I noticed that I was deeply affected by not taking care of myself in the early postpartum weeks and eventually months. It actually got to the point where I was breaking down mentally. I could barely get through each day. I soon realized that there was something actually wrong. I went to see a therapist, was diagnosed with postpartum depression, and
Mhm.
self-care was pivotal for me. That was a major missing component that, as soon as I started practicing that after my diagnosis, I was able to not that I was able to. I mean, yeah, I mean there was a self-empowerment there too, but I was able to see the fog just kind of melt away.
Yeah.
Once I started to bring the sunshine in on myself and say, "Hey, mama needs some care too. It's not all about baby. I have a life too."
Right, right. And that all of those things can happen, right? It can all happen, right? You can be um, focused on the work and then focused on your children and focused on, whatever outside activities you are. And there's this constant churn, this constant running to do something next. And in reality, now I can look back and say, well, was I effective? Right?
Ooh,
Was I really delivering what I needed to deliver? Because you're checking boxes and not
right,
necessarily having the experience. Even you may have you may have an intention of accomplishment, but are you really looking at all of the different things to make sure that they're brought in so that because especially when you're in sales, you are part of a team, right? Are you delivering to your team the what they're expecting, not just kind of the fluff or the end result. Did you hit the number? Yes. Maybe you hit the number, but did you deliver all the things and the support to other people along the journey, right? And the same is true with, your marriage or your children, right? Yes, maybe I made it to the event, but was I really the one who was there helping, one of them study their lines in preparation for an event?
right,
You're there on the phone, right? You're calling because again, there was no internet, no FaceTime. Then you may be calling and say, "Okay, recite the lines." But even with that, you're still doing some other work and you're half listening. So I have really, at this point, I can honestly say, if I could do anything differently, it's be more present and participatory in a way that allows you to fully immerse yourself in whatever else you're doing because the work is going to be the work. It's going to be there
right,
and
right.
so, nine times out of the 10, the company that you're working for, it's gonna be there. It's not gonna fall apart, right? Because we have these grandiose, like, I must be the one that does this work. Not really.
Yeah,
No, no, a lot of people can do the work, right? Everybody can make a contribution here. And so, again, it's not gonna fall apart if I don't deliver today, right? Or at least I need to communicate and plan and say, okay, here's realistically when the deliverable can be there, right? So,
yeah,
but
yeah,
I don't know if I could have done that 30 years ago. I can do it now, right?
yeah,
I can say it now, but 30 years ago, I would have been probably too afraid to do that.
Oh, and how do you so other than gaining experience, is there anything else that we can do to try to combat this fear, work through it? Is there anything we could do, or do we just have to slog it out day after day and eventually figure it out?
It's funny. I watch and I listen to younger people work, right? And I think because sometimes I think there's an extreme, the other side, and I'm not sure I feel comfortable with that either. I think that right now there are 5 generations in the work world, right? And I think that with those 5 generations, because there's still some boomers. Technically, I'm a boomer, right? So there's some boomers and X and Y, Z, millennials, and I think there's got to be better communication, and a lot of this is going to be driven by the culture of an organization, right? Because you don't want the relationships to be combative. You don't want the boomers and the Xers to say, "Oh, well, in my day we did it this way," right? um, there's some value in that, right? Because
Voice.
we didn't have the technology that is available now, so a lot of it was we had to think it through to
Mhm.
figure it out, right? We did not have AI that was going to help us. We literally just had to have pencil and paper and figure out what the outcome could potentially be here, right? So we were building models based on our own thoughts. Now, some of those models were flawed, but we were doing it. Whereas younger people, I think, are very reliant on the technology, and I think the technology is a significant contribution and a valuable tool to have access to. But I do also think that thinking about how you get from A to Z and what those steps in between are really important. And I think sometimes the technology kind of bypasses that and gives an answer or provides an answer and not necessarily understand the value of the process. I do. I am a huge proponent of working remotely because I've worked remotely for a really long time before I started my business and while I worked in corporate America. Um, what I realized, but I didn't start working probably remotely until I was probably in my early 40s, right? What I do value about going into an office is not only the culture of an organization, the camaraderie that you build with your colleagues is really valuable. I listen to a lot of young people now and they say, "Oh, no, I get my work done." That's important, right? It's really important that you get your work done. But it doesn't really help define the culture of an organization. And we could sit here and really reflect on why that is the case. Maybe it's important to look at the historical context, but I think, I talk to people now and I say, I personally think the best approach is a hybrid approach, right? Where people get the opportunity to interact with people who may not have the same worldview, right? But it does give you, I think, a richer experience to hear from somebody or to connect with somebody who may think something totally different from you, but they are bringing still something valuable in their abilities to think about and build trust and a relationship and deliverables, right? So I think working in person does that in ways that doesn't really happen, when you're on a Zoom call. But I also think, do you really want to go in 5 days? Not necessarily. So I'm a supporter of a three in, two out kind of situation if you can do that.
Yeah, yeah. I've noticed that there has been a huge cultural shift here in the States away from working in office in favor of the hybrid or fully remote way
Yeah,
to work. And part of that is because it does help parents, right? Parents may not necessarily be able to afford as much childcare if they're in the office 5 days a week. It's really expensive. I mean, it's comparable to a mortgage or rent. So it's
yeah,
like imagine paying double what you're paying just for your cost of living for somebody to also help you take care of your child.
yeah.
So, going remote, that helps to mitigate that cost.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
What's really interesting? I was having this exchange recently with somebody on social media, and the person's post was that she was opposed to people having to go into an office for a couple of reasons. One, her cost of clothing, two, wear and tear on her vehicle, and time spent away from home because of her commute, right? So that meant her expenses were going to go up. Now, as a business owner, my thoughts were, well, your expenses didn't go down when you were working remotely. So I didn't lower your salary. I don't know that that's a fair way to look at it. But I do think that, yes, I don't know. Like I said, I had somebody who lived with us. Um, I don't know if I could afford that these days because it's a really big expense, right? I am really empathetic to, um, especially now when work is not usually a luxury. Most situations require two incomes, right? And in requiring or needing those two incomes, you are working, but you're still trying to take care of your child who you're in the house, and so you're doing multiple things. So it I think that kind of our living costs and just, the cost of us operating ourselves has become so expensive that I don't know how tenable this is much longer like this, right? But you do also, part of working outside of the home, right? Going into an office. Like I said, you're building relationships. Um, you're also supporting like small businesses like mine, right? Because we need the foot traffic. We need or we rely on the foot traffic as a part of the day to day. So it's a challenge that I think, we're as a society, we're going to have to spend some time figuring out what that path is and what is going to be a win for the majority. I don't think that nobody's going to want to go back to a 5-day work week. Although and we have to be mindful, right? There's a especially right now, this question about will manufacturing be brought back to the United States? Well, you can't manufacture remotely, right? You can't do it, right? That's just not the way that works. You're
Yeah.
going to physically have to go someplace, right? So we will have to address that. We'll have to address, and that lends itself to some kind of class division. So I think as we think about ourselves as a society, what is that going to look like for all of us?
Yeah, yeah. Ultimately, what I've heard before when I think I was pregnant when I heard this. It was this little clip about how if we design the world with parents and children in mind, it would be a much more accessible world for all. And that stuck with me. Every time I go somewhere and I experience something, gosh, I'm trying to think of an example here. Ah, of course I can't think of one right now. But it's, you go out into the world and you think, okay, so maybe parking lots. Let's just talk about parking lots for a second, right? How could a parking lot be improved to better maintain the safety of a parent with child, right? Maybe there's a different way we design the walkways or something. I don't know. I'm not a designer in that regard, but as we go out into the world and we shift our lens and we say, okay, it's not just me on this planet walking around. There are other people too with other needs. How can we better design this world? I don't know. It was just like a fun little snippet that I heard.
Yeah, no, and I think there's a lot of that goes on, especially in other countries, right? I've been to Spain a few times, and w- it is completely normal, to sit out on the patio at 9 in the evening, and children and families are out, just enjoying life, right? Um, eh, I remember telling somebody this story recently. I was in Paris once, and it was during the middle of the week. I was there working, and I had my dinner and a glass of wine, and I was waiting for the check, right? So 10 minutes go by, 10 whole minutes, right? And so I finally say to the owner, please have my check. And he says, well, where do you have to go? And I said, what? Like, what are you talking about? Now I'm from New York. They are trying to turn those tables in New York really quickly. I felt like 10 minutes was way too long. And I was like, well, what do you mean, where do I have to go? He's like, you don't have anywhere to go. You're probably going to go back to your hotel to work. And I said, I am. That is exactly what I'm going to do. And so he says, sit down, just have some more wine and relax, right? There are other places that design living in a very different way that we think about living, right? We think about, when you think about the density of Paris, which is, because I'm from New York, I appreciate dense cities. It's very walkable, right? So we think about how to live, especially in New York, without necessarily an automobile, right? And how much more functional mass transit and public transportation is because New York needs to work on some of its public transportation because it fails in comparison to the rest of the world. But that is still the biggest one and the most efficient that we have in the US. So I do think that in terms of like our infrastructure and how we use the things that we use on a day to day basis, we've got some opportunities to rethink and reimagine how things are going to be best served for all of us, right? Because I do think about, yes, how do we service how a family is going to use resources. I also think about, especially as I age, how does a senior citizen use the services, right? And how do younger people use their services? And so it becomes much safer for us all to be invested in how we kind of live our lives, right? So which you can tell, obviously, I'm a very city-oriented person. I believe in, I believe in cities. I think that cities should be very functional for people, regardless of where they are in life.
Yes. Oh my goodness. If I wish I could go back to that restaurant and bottle up that man's voice and keep that in my head and just be like, Kayla, where do you have to go? Really?
Right, it was so funny. He was like, "Where do you have to go?" Now, at the same time, again, I've been in Paris, and like 2 in the afternoon. And they're looking at me like, okay, you may not be going to your hotel, but you are leaving here. Okay. Because they want their downtime. That is their time. They're not going to be sitting there like, working because you are sitting there, using your laptop or doing whatever. They're like, okay, it's time. And it's time. So they it's interesting, again, going back to looking through somebody else's lens, right? You're looking through somebody else's lens and you have a different type of appreciation for how you want to live your life, right?
Yes, yes. Oh my goodness. So that makes me that helps me gain a deeper appreciation for younger millennials and Gen Zers who are actively telling society, "Hey, it's not all about work. There is a life out there that needs to be lived." And on the other side of the coin, we have our boomers who are teaching us the value of really digesting and learning a topic instead of just relying on AI to do it for us. I
It changes, right? And I think back to when my children were younger, and like I said, my career did real, I was doing well with my career, and we had a really big house, right? One of those McMansions. And at the time, I assigned a lot of value to that, right? When I tell you now, if I could figure out how to live in a tiny house, I would do it. I would do it, right? Because again, you're working, and so there is this connection, or at least there used to be this connection between how much you worked, what titles you have, what financial resources you had as a result of the work, and what your investment was in your home and your automobile and what have you, right? Whereas I look at young people now, and there's less emphasis increasingly. I don't see them wanting, 5,000 square foot McMansions, right? They're looking at the environment, right? They're looking at their carbon footprint. They're looking at things very differently. So that has been a shift for
yeah.
me as I think about my professional journey. It's not really what my income is that determines how big my house should be. My income is really for me to have other experiences with, right? Which is even now with my tea company, right? I loved selling media. It was great, but it's really been a blessing to be able to have my tea company. And I think about the geopolitical nature of what it is like in regions that are growing tea. I would never have thought about that before, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So now I'm thinking about, like, what impact, right? Our focus as a company is to source teas from growers who are growing responsibly and harvesting ethically, right? The tea consumption, and I'm assuming this is true probably of coffee, that's not a space that I'm in, but tea consumption is outpacing the growth. And part of the reason for that is because we've got climate change challenges, right? And so now I've got to look at climate challenges in a very different way than I did at other times. One of the things that I find when I'm talking with young buyers, they really like to know when like if I can show them that they want to see the traceability of the tea, right? So I can say, well, this is a farmer that I worked with in Bhutan, and it's a women's cooperative. So I know the women are paying each other fairly because it's a cooperative. And then it's shipped from Bhutan to Connecticut to me in Georgia. Um, and so there's a full accountability of the journey. I don't know when I was younger if I would have ever thought about those things.
Do you think it's your market that opened that up for you, or do you think it was a half half? You're living in this society that's shifting away from just consumption, and more into, hey, let's get to know where our products are coming from and how they're affecting our environment.
I would love to believe that I could take the credit and say that I saw this coming.
Yeah.
but, but the reality is, maybe I saw some of it coming. Part of it, some of it is my personal journey, right? And just in talking, I remember years ago talking to some of the producers and asking about organic teas, where I learned a lot about some of the benefits of things that are organic, and some of them that are not necessarily so beneficial. But I learned a lot more about some of the things that the producers are doing as it relates to growing. I'm by no means a farmer or an authority on agriculture, but I learned a lot more about, how do growers, especially some of the artisanal growers, how are they using water more efficiently, right? So things that I hadn't looked at before, right? That now I need to look at, because I do see, again, maybe a little late, but I do see that I am a steward of, you know, of this world, right? And I've got to be responsible in terms of what I'm doing. So a lot of the teas that we work with, or growers, the teas that are in our portfolio, are from producers who handpick the teas, right? So that's labor intensive. That is
Yeah.
labor intensive work. They tend to be women, right? Because their hands are smaller, so women pick a lot. So my responsibility, if I'm saying that I'm going to be a good steward of whatever resources I've been assigned, then that is my commitment needs to be to ensure that I'm working with producers who are paying people fairly throughout the supply chain, right? So I've got this responsibility as a somebody who's consuming her tea and somebody who's selling tea, and also if I'm talking to, I do a lot of B2B and sell to corporations, but when I'm selling to individuals, I have to have that same kind of conversation. So it's tailored to both of them. Talking to corporations, I'm like, listen, this is what your company says that you're focused on. And this is how our teas align with that. And it comes to individuals, that conversation is the same, that some people are really committed to that, right? And so those are conversations that are relatively easy. But there's some people who you're introducing the concept to them, and they're some are interested, and to be honest, some are just not, right? And so I can't make that judgment for people. I just have the opportunity to share with them. This is why, from what I understand, this is why it's important, and accept it or leave it alone.
Yeah, yeah. Now, if someone is trying to start their own business, get into ethical manufacturing of any product, whether it's tea, coffee, clothing, technology, whatever it is, how would you what advice would you give them? What red flags are there to look out for? What green flags where you're like, this is the one? How do you go about that?
Oh, that is a long list. And I say I was actually I had breakfast last week with a young lady who is starting her business, and I said, "Listen, I'm not just going to dump on you, but I'm going to tell you all the red flags or all the things that I missed that one cost me a lot of money, right?
Ooh.
Because I just didn't know, and how you safeguard yourself." So I think that there are a lot of people who take courses, right? And I support courses. I do. I think you should. But what I would always encourage people, and I didn't know this then, or I didn't think about it, I should say, if someone is selling a course to you on how to start a business, make sure that that person knows how to sell a product and not a service, right?
Oh. Yeah.
It's very different margins, very different experiences, right?
Oh.
And so because this woman had already signed up for the course, and she was taking a service-oriented course. I said, "Of course, and they're telling you this and this and this." She's like, "Yeah." I said, "That's not this has nothing to do with your business. You're selling a product, right? So you've got to look at your products differently." I would also say, um, save your money and don't take all of these courses, and research. There are many foundations. Like, I did an event the other day. I attended an event the other day, and this was an actually online event with the Tory Burch Foundation. It was free, and there was a wealth of information about people who were starting businesses, and it was for both. It was people who were starting businesses as well as people who were in business, and they shared with us a lot of different types of ways to look at, your operational costs, what your packaging is going to look like. Are you going to have an outside packager? Are they going to take on the distribution? How you're negotiating your contracts if you decide you want to be with a big box or a retailer, if you got to sell a product. Those are the things that can be very attractive when you look at them. Have an attorney. to read those contracts, but not just an attorney, somebody with a solid business mind, right? So let's just say you get a big contract with a big box retailer and that looks great. One of the things that you want to be really mindful of if you've got a product is, are they going to issue a PO or are they telling you net 30, right?
Mm-hmm.
The net 30, maybe net 180, right? And so
Yep.
you now have laid out the cash and you
Mm-hmm.
haven't not gotten paid through. You also need to make sure you understand what your sell-through rate is, right? And if your sell-through rate is underperforming and then they start cutting the costs because they're offering sales incentives to drive traffic, that's your money, right? It's not their money, it's your money, right? So
Right.
I would always say, and again, I didn't do this and I wish I had, um, I would start with an advisory board, right? And make sure that advisory board has people on it who understand, maybe not specifically what you're doing, but have an idea of, they have good business minds, right? So it you may have your cousin Sally, who's a great criminal defense attorney, but she's not a business attorney. So do not put her on your board. Just because she's an attorney, do not put Sally on your board unless you're looking, unless you think, um, you're gonna have some antitrust violations, maybe, but you're not there yet, right?
Sorry,
Um,
Sally, you're not on the list.
or you're not on the list. You want somebody you want people who are on your advisory board who are so in your corner, right? That they're going to say to you, that's not a good idea. Or let's
Yes.
look at this in a different way. Or they're going to ask you, what are you trying to accomplish? And then you back into it, right? Because there are some times when we're like, I was very intentional about my packaging, right? Because packaging was really important for me. I'm a very visual person. I did spend a lot more on the packaging initially than I actually should have, right? But I learned, right? And then I started using different resources. I spent a lot on the tea, and I still spend a lot on the tea because I'm very focused on having a clean supply chain and that people are paid fairly and that the end product is you're going to get a really good quality tea. Those are fine. Um, there are Now this is where the technology comes to play, right? You can have QuickBooks, right? Which is relatively inexpensive. But you know what? There's always a newcomer in the space that you don't necessarily have to spend the $27 a month on QuickBook, and you may want to go to Zero, which is I think it's XERO, where you're spending $7 a month. There's only $13, but those $13 adds up because they're your $13. You don't have the, there are times before and you work in a corporation, you're like, I'll put it on my expense report, right? Or there's always there are always staples that like all these products, all these things that you use. There's always paper, there's always paper that you can copy. Everything is available when you work in corporate America. That's their that's their operational expense. And I'm not trying to suggest that I wasn't a good steward, but they're just things that you use, right? There's a calculator. Oh, my calculator's broken. Let me just call whoever and I'll get another calculator. Now I'm like, is it broken or does it just need a new battery? Okay.
Yes.
I have to think about things very differently because I fund this, right? Another thing that I would suggest to people, and I've tried to live by this motto, is grow slow so I don't owe, right?
Ooh.
Yes,
Okay, let's dive into
you
that.
gotta grow slow, because it's attractive to be able to have a product that's growing so fast and you need investors. And that's great. That's great that you're growing that fast, maybe. But now somebody else doesn't have, they're looking at your P&L in a very different way than you're looking at your P&L. And if you take that money, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying think about what it means to take that investor money, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
are you scaling the business because you need those resources, or are you scaling the business because you're going to make a lot of money? right?
Mm.
And I'm not saying making a lot of money is a bad thing. I'm not trying to suggest that at all. I am saying though, think about what your drivers are for why you want to do this. And I would say to me, just grow slow so you don't know, right? And then you own your business 100%.
Yeah. Yes. Oh my goodness. I'm hearing so many gems.
Oh,
The
thank you.
first yeah.
All the ways I lost money.
Well, that's how we learn, right? We
Yeah, it was an expensive. There was some expensive losses, but yes. And that, and that seriously, that is why I'm so thankful to be able to share this, right? Because I'm saying to people, and at the end, they certainly can, I encourage people, go to my website, send me an email, my phone number's there because I'm one of those, again, I'm old school, right? So I believe you should be able to call people. I know a lot of websites don't have phone numbers. I'm much more likely to talk to you. Um, and ask questions. And if I have the answer, I am more than happy to share it because I don't want you to burn through money the way I did, making mistakes.
it's super easy to do. There are so many potholes that you could get stuck in if you just don't know how to navigate around them.
Exactly, exactly.
And now, a quick message from our sponsor. Looking to take your brand, team, or event to the next level with custom gear that stands out? Virtue Screen Printing is your go-to one-stop shop for high-quality custom apparel and accessories. Whether you're launching a clothing line, gearing up your staff, or repping your squad, Virtue brings your vision to life with custom hats, shirts, hoodies, socks, beanies, and more. We're not talking cookie cutter merch. This is premium, fully customizable gear made with care and attention to detail. What makes Virtue different? It's simple. Low minimums, fast turnaround, hands-on customer service, and a passion for helping brands look good. From bold designs to subtle branding, they do it all and they do it right. Visit virtuemfg.com to get started or hit them up directly for a custom quote. That's virtuemfg.com, where vision meets craftsmanship. virtuemfg.com. Thank you for staying with us, and back to the show.
One of the other things that I think it's important to look at, a couple of things. One, definitely create now this I did early on, have separate bank accounts. Do not
Oh,
commingle the money. Have
yeah.
your business account, it should be that be your business account, and your personal account be your personal account. Keep those separate. It makes it so much easier at the end of the year for when you're doing your taxes or when you're doing your quarterly taxes, right? It's just a lifesaver. Um, SCORE is a wonderful resource. So the
Yes.
Small Business Administration, believe me, the Small Business Administration wants to see us succeed. So they provide organizations like assistance through places like SCORE. And you know what? If you need more assistance, there's a Google search, right? Because there's so many organizations out there. The small business, there's a what is the name of that organization? It's the minority women. There's one for minorities, there's one for women, and these are organizations that help you get the certification. So if you are working with larger organizations, they all have a database, and they look in that database to make sure that you're there, and it becomes a lot easier to get contracts. So, and I haven't pursued this intentionally, but there are a lot of government contracts, right? Even
Oh.
even for me as a tea company, right? And the reason, for example, one of the opportunities, my college boyfriend and I are still friends, and he was in the military, right? And he was a general or something. And he says, the bases around the world, people buy products on the base.
Oh, I've never
This
thought
is
about that.
I didn't either. And he said, "Well, I know a little something, I know a little." But yeah, so you may sell a product. You may sell handbags. There are women in the military in Germany, in Japan. Pick a country that they're going to buy your handbags because they're in the commissary.
My goodness.
Who knew, right?
It's a whole world. It's a whole world out there, people.
Whole entire world, a whole world of stuff that I was like, I would have never in a million years had he not said that to me about doing it. Now, and it's not that I'm not going to do it. I just don't have the bandwidth right now to add it on, but, we are looking at that for 2026 so that we can the thing that you have to do is make sure that you can distribute products in another country, right? So that's why you don't want your cousin Sally, who is a criminal defense attorney. You really want somebody who understands business and knows how to help you sell globally because you have to have different licensure, right? And especially now, we've got tariffs going on. So that's something else, right? That's not within my control, but I sell tea. The majority of it comes from China, right?
Right, right,
So, so now, I spent a lot of time figuring out, and there's a resource for everything, right? There are companies out there that can do the research for you for pricing, but you will have to pay for that. And I wasn't going to pay for that. And so I spent a lot of time researching where my mid-range is for what was acceptable for the personas that I had built out to reach with my messaging and my price point, right? But like I said, 55, almost 60% of the teas that are in our portfolio are from China. There's a tariff now of 120 some odd percent, right?
right,
Right. So I'm still going to sell Chinese teas, but I can't pass that on to
right,
somebody else. I mean, some of it I can, some of it I can push back to my producers and ask for a little lower rate, but the majority is going to fall on me, which means that comes out of my profits, right?
right.
And then how do you pivot your business quickly given an external influencer that's impacting your business, right? We're gonna sell a lot more teas from India. That's it, So we do carry teas from India. We do carry teas from Bhutan. We do carry teas um, from Nepal, from tea producing regions around the world. So we're going to be carrying more. China, that's going to be a hard thing to cover, right? So instead of having 55 to 60% of my tea from China, maybe it'll go down to 35%. And then I increase my tea from Kenya, from India, because they have tariffs also, but not to the same degree, right? So, one of the things that we were really intentional about when we were positioning the brand is that we wanted people to know that we were a resource that you could buy teas from us from all the tea producing regions of the world. It so happens that I worked with a lot more growers in China. That's changing. And now I'm expanding to reach out and work with more of my growers in India, in Thailand, in Korea, in Vietnam, in Japan, and this is where your marketing and your marketing communications is going to be really important, right? That messaging around here's the opportunity for you to expand your palate and taste more teas from someplace else. But you know, it's it's almost a blessing, right? Because it's really
Yeah.
helping me diversify and lean
Yes.
into more producers in ways that I wasn't going to.
Yes.
And is it a blessing? It's what I have to tell myself so I don't become really annoying.
Look, we're making lemonades out of lemon here.
Oh,
Like we
yeah, so that's
that's the
it.
best we could do. No, and that's another great lesson for somebody who is going into the manufacturing space. You really don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket. If you can diversify your manufacturers that actually make your product, if you're not the one manufacturing, right? If you're diversifying those efforts, you have less of a chance of completely falling flat if your manufacturer falls flat.
Yeah, so here's the flip side of that, right? So yes, you want to be really mindful of the relationship that you have with your manufacturer and you don't want that manufacturer. And I would encourage you if you can go to, if they're producing for you in India that you go visit their facilities and make sure that they're, meeting the criteria that you expect them to meet. At the same time, I would say you don't want to spread yourself too thin because you need consistency in your product, right? So you want to be able to say, all right, I'm producing a product and let's just say it's food, right? How many different companies do you really want to share your recipe with? Because that's your recipe, and IP laws outside of the US are very different than IP laws in the US.
Right, right, and discuss for listeners what an IP law is. Just a little brief.
Intellectual property, right? So I I made the decision that I did not want to pack outside of the US. So I make all of my blends in house, right? So I keep the recipes. And
Oh,
I provide the ingredient list, but I don't provide the formula. And I don't want to get to that space, right? I am okay with growing my business, and I will still always bring all ingredients in-house, all raw materials in-house, and make the formulas. I get countless calls, and it's probably less labor intensive for me if I were to outsource that, but I don't want to give up my IP, right? One of
yes,
the things that we're
right.
seeing a lot right now, especially during this tariff war, is we're seeing all over TikTok, right? People are talking about, oh, it's the same bag and we're just making it here. And so, again, we have different IP laws in different places around the world. So you can't hold somebody accountable, or maybe you could try, but
Good luck.
Sally, your cousin is not an IP lawyer either. so, so this is where, again, this is where you have to think about who's on your advisory board.
Right, right. You only want to work with people who are experts in the same position that you need their help with.
Exactly, exactly. So when you know I I have an uncle who's a great accountant. His specialty was creating offshore accounts for high net worth people. That was his specialty. And I remember when I was starting and I was saying this to him, he said, "Well, John can help you." And I said, "No, that is not the specialty that I need." Even no matter how much of a discount he gives me, right? I'm like, he's really expensive because he has a real strong expertise that he has worked with globally. Aside from the fact that I don't need that, I need somebody who understands manufacturing accounting, right? They understand
Mhm.
cost accounting in a
Mhm.
way that's going to help me make sure that my business is always in compliance.
Yes. Yes, yes. That is which by the way, you mentioned earlier service-based business versus product-based business. That is a huge differentiating factor is the bookkeeping. The books are
Yep.
so, so, so different. You
So
wanna
so
make sure
different.
you have specialists who are actually helping
Exactly.
you with your books if
Exactly.
you don't know how to do it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yep.
and I don't know how to do it, right? So I have to. So again, think about those margins because you got to pay the accountant, right?
Yes.
Think about those margins, right? Because you've got to pay your attorney, right? Think about those because and those are things that you should set up initially, early on in this process. You need to set that up, and I would think. I don't know. I would think most accountants are going to tell you you do not need to start up as an S corp, that you probably should start up as an LLC, and that you're going to be safe until you reach a certain revenue number.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then there's some
Yep.
advantages to one over the other, pending how your tax liabilities exist.
1,000%. Yeah, that's where having a good CPA comes into play because you can ask him or her, "Hey, my revenue is X amount, my expenses are X amount, this is my net. Am I ready to file my business as an S corp or do I leave it as is?" Or even in some businesses, do I even need an LLC? Can I get away with a sole prop? These are all really important business formation questions that you ask early on, and then
Hmm.
you check in with over time, maybe on an annual basis when you're doing your taxes. Hey, are we still good?
Yeah, yeah. There are times. It's funny. I was talking to my accountant today. I said, I think I should do such a thing. She's like, and I think you're not a CPA. So let's just not even. That is
That's a
that,
good CPA. It's really,
exactly.
really important to
Yeah,
have
she's
people
like,
on your board who are not yes people. If you have
right. She's
yes
like,
people on
yeah,
your board,
right.
they're
It's
not
right.
helpful.
But she was like, yeah, you're not a CPA, and that is a bad idea. We have a great relationship. We've worked together for years. She's like, "That is a bad idea for you."
Love her. Keep her.
Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, so there's so many little gems that I've learned. Like I said, I had lunch with somebody last week or breakfast, and I was just giving her all the things that I spend money on that I didn't need to spend money on or lost money on because I just hadn't thought it through. And there were times, right? And this is where the emotional toll takes in, right? I was like, I'm smart. I did this. I, negotiated contracts with other people. How did I not see this? How did I
Yeah.
not see that? Right. And as much as I try to look at things through the lens of somebody else, I didn't know how to think like an owner. Right.
Oh.
Right. And now I think like an owner in ways that were I remember I was talking to a really good friend of mine who I don't call myself an entrepreneur because I think that's an inaccurate word. I'm a small business owner, but this is a friend of mine who's really an entrepreneur. And so I had a breakdown one night a couple of years ago and I called him. He's in California and I'm crying and he's just like, "Oh, that didn't make sense. Why did you do this? And why did you do that?" And I was like, "Well, I thought this." And he said, "Girl, you do not work in corporate America anymore." So I said, "Yeah." And so he said, "What? So tell me what you think you should do given you having a little bit of money or you having spent this amount of money and you only yielded this." And I said, "Well, I need to get to this." He said, "So back into what you need to get to and what's the priority, right?" And I think back when I was selling, um, somebody may come to me and say, "I need to do this, I need to do that, I need to do this." And then I would say to them, "Okay, great. Here's what that's going to cost." And they'd say, "Oh, wait, I don't have the budget to do that." And then we would sit down and say, "Okay, well, let's scale this, right? What's an absolute must? Oh,
Mhm.
this is a must. What about this? That's a must too. Okay, so those are the musts. This is important, but we can do this part later while we satisfy the must." And I think about that a lot now in running my business. Like, I must do, I must have a certain amount of inventory, right?
Yeah.
And just like I said, with the current tariff situation, I must sell, I must buy. This is the harvesting season right now, right? So I must buy X amount of dollars worth of inventory to carry me through the next 6 months till the second harvest comes, right?
Oh,
And
right.
so tariffs have an impact, right? Because
Mhm.
what would have been maybe $100,000 worth of tea now is 200 and some odd $1,000. And I get the same tea. So it's not like I'm getting more tea. I'm
Right.
getting the same amount. So it's not
Yeah.
like I can say, "Oh, I'm going to spend $200,000 and that's going to give me a lot more yield." It's not.
Right.
It's just gonna
Um,
give me the so I had to say, "Okay, let me back into this," and I find myself doing that a lot. Let me back into this. Oh, let me pivot, because there's still a demand, right, for Indian teas and Japanese teas, and then I'm gonna have to push, and so then I monitor that on a day-to-day basis. What's happening in this space that's going to impact my business, right? So the pivot was, I'm gonna be maybe 30% on Chinese teas as opposed to 60% and increase all the other teas from someplace else, right?
right,
So
right, right. Yeah, so it sounds like I'm hearing two things. First, you want a goal in mind. You need to understand where you want to take your business. And then secondly, it's evaluating what's actually going on out in the world and how does that affect your supply chain and your end consumer as well. So keeping an eye on what's actually happening and not just doing the same old that's previously worked for your business.
and I have to be honest, and again, my children are now adults, right? And they're tremendously helpful. So I do events with Bloomingdale's once a month, right? And so we'll do activations with them. And so it's a great partnership to have. When I tell you, my kids and my grandchildren are out there with me,
Love that.
helping me to look at things in a way, right? When we're setting up, my granddaughter who's 9, is there. She's like, "Nah, this needs to be moved over. We can move this here. We can, so we do have this bond. I have a wonderful relationship with my children now, where they are there helping me out. One of my daughters, my middle daughter, she's my comedian, and she's like, "Listen, my job here is to look and make suggestions. Those other 2, they can do the picking of the teas up and let's having a good time." Um, but I'm thankful, right, that I've got a family who's really supportive of what I'm doing and the work that we're able to produce. And so I'm working on being better at social media, right? And they'll look at my stuff on social media. They're like, "We need to hire somebody." So so now, actually, again, now this is you have to think about this, right? This is coming out of my profits. And when you think about your social media usage, right? What is the platform, and what are the platforms that are going to be best for your type of business, right? That's
Yep.
important. So
Yep.
I 85% of my business is B2B. As I'm interviewing people to become my social media manager, I'm gonna need them to be comfortable in navigating LinkedIn, right?
Mhm. Yep. Yep.
Some Facebook, but navigating LinkedIn, right? And then that's gotta tie to the message of, why these Indian teas are great, why these, So you're constantly finding yourself thinking about this. Sometimes I do, I think about people who start businesses by themselves, right? And I say, I see why people have partners in business, right?
Yeah.
Because there's somebody else to lift some of the stuff that you're not able to do by yourself.
Yes, yes, yes. Or and for those out there who are solopreneurs or solo business owners,
Yeah.
it's at least important to have that advisory board, like previously
Absolutely.
mentioned. I
Yep.
mean, I think Renee, you hit that right on the head. Like you got to have people who can do things in a very specific way for a very specific function for your business and have them be good at it. You don't want Sally, right? Who doesn't know what she's
Be a great
sure.
criminal lawyer, right? But you
Right,
don't need a
right.
criminal lawyer, you need a business lawyer. And so her skill set is different. And you need to really be mindful of where and how you're sourcing, right?
Yes.
Right? This is something else I would share. Make sure your mission statement is clear, right? Because that contributes to the culture that you build, right? But
Yeah.
in making your mission statement clear, you can stay on track, right? There are times when producers may come to me and they're driven by sale, right? They're driven by cost, and that's not my business. My business is not driven by the cost of the tea. It's an important factor, but it's not the sole price. So they, because as built out the mission, I built out the qualifiers for who I was going to use as a producer. And if they couldn't meet this, right? If I say that I only want hand picked teas, right? And they're telling me they're picking by machine. I'm not saying machine picking is bad. It's just not a part of my business model, right? So I can easily eliminate because I promise you, when you start your business, whether it's a service or a product, but especially a product, everyone that you never imagined will be calling you trying to sell you something. I
That's
get
so true.
I get so many outreach efforts. I mean, there are times when I come into my office and there's just tea everywhere, right? 'Cause it's just people send it to you, they just ship it, and I'm like, "Okay." So
Oh, here we
initially,
go again.
I used to always try to drink it all, right, just to taste it. Then I said, "Some of it is great, but it's not necessarily what I want." So before I go through that, let's go through, are you meeting the criteria that I have set? That
Yes.
aligns with my mission. So, and if they're not, then I'm more than happy to say, you know what? Here's somebody I know who's playing in your space. Because I always like to pass forward the information. Here's somebody who's playing in your space. You might be able to make a sale here. You may be able to be a good provider for this one, right? It just doesn't align with what I'm doing.
Yeah, this goes back to that scarcity versus abundant mindset. It's okay to say no if something just isn't in alignment. If anything, you're sparing yourself future heartache.
Exactly, exactly. So it's you do find yourself thinking a lot about the stuff, right? The little details, right? I wish I could spend 90% of my time tasting teas and sharing teas with people. That would be the greatest, more like 20% of my time, right? It's not the reality of how I get to spend my day, right? And it was a valuable lesson to learn that, oh, I don't get to just drink tea all day and make it look, oh no, I've got other things I've got to do. So, yeah. So
Yeah, yeah. It's about
that's
prioritizing what's urgent. I always think of the four quadrants, right? You've got the urgent and important, the not urgent, not important, and the not important. So it's just like
right.
just prioritize the things, focus
That
on what's urgent, important, and important because those are your business builders and keep on chugging. Oh my goodness, Renee, so many gems.
let me share one last one, and this is
Yes,
one
please.
that it took me a minute to figure out. So when you've got a product, right, and especially if it's food, and then everybody is going to invite you to participate in the pop up, right, to do a pop up shop.
Yeah.
Right? And let me share why, right? Some of them work, right? And so if you treat this as a line item in terms of marketing and just want to get mass exposure, then it's fine, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But be mindful that it costs you to get there, right? You've got to pay whatever the fee is. You've got to bring the food. You've got to prepare the food. You've got to give away the free food, but it's not free
Right.
because you paid for it, right?
Right. Right.
And people will come by and just, oh, can I taste? Can I taste? Can I taste? Can I taste? They're never gonna buy. They're never gonna buy from you. Now, if you are able to treat that like a line item, okay, fine. You're like, okay, this is just exposure because there were 2,000 people that saw my brand today, right? And um, maybe I spent $300 and I'm able to collect, you know, 50 emails. Still a high acquisition cost for your
Yeah.
emails, but you did
Yeah.
get some exposure, right?
Right.
Um, I think that I would look at, if you, let's say you've got, some biscotti that you've made and it's high quality ingredients. You source the flour from King Arthur and it's really expensive. I,
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
not I would not be at just the average pop-up shop. But I would say, you know what, there may be a gourmet store, there may be a fresh market, there may be a Whole Foods, and you get the benefit of their marketing, right? And you're able to leverage that because you're in there doing a pop-up with people who can say, you know what, the average box of biscotti may be $6, but yours may be 11, and they're willing to spend that extra $5 because of the quality of the ingredients, and you can tell your story, right?
Yes.
But
Yes.
generic pop-ups, sometimes they work, but I have found them to be a really expensive line item in marketing, and I don't really do them. And then which leads to everyone will call you and ask you for a donation.
Mm.
Right? You
Mm.
have no idea of how many tea boxes. So I've gotten to the point now where I put a cap on how many tea events and boxes I will do a year. Some of
Mhm.
them can be great exposure, right? And those have been fine, right? Some of them I w I was just like, "Okay, I just gave away." I just, I was just that was just a give me, right? There was no return there. And you're not always looking for a return, but you have to be mindful that you bought it was your packaging, it was your product, it was your shipping costs, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And, so don't be afraid to ask if somebody calls and says, "Hey, we're doing this great event during World Cup, and we'd like you to donate whatever." More often than not, they'll say no, but don't be afraid to ask for their email list, so of who they're marketing to,
Mm,
or
oh,
how much, where can your logo be placed on that, right? You'll start to
right.
find that, people are not, they know the value of their brands, but they don't necessarily, I would say they don't respect the value of your brand. They think their brand is worth a lot more and that you should be happy to give them products. And there have been a couple of like high end organizations that I've said, yeah, that's a no.
Yeah.
That is a
Yeah.
hard no, because
Yeah.
and I'm like, because your exposure for me is, it's not a measurable ROI.
Right. Right.
So
Right. It has to be a win-win partnership with whatever deal you're going into, whether it's strictly marketing or you're going in it looking for conversions or sales. You want those numbers to make sense.
right, right, right,
Yep.
right.
Yep. Yep.
So, get those kids out there, let them tell you a story for you, tell you, you remind them. And I am that mother that says, I gave birth to you. I was in out labor for hours for you. You have to help me.
Ask you, how do you build a family structure where they want to help you? No, it's guilt. We're guilting our daughters into
Yeah,
this.
although, so again, my middle daughter is my comedian, right? And I was only in labor with her for 3 hours, right? So
My gosh. Yeah.
she's like, have paid that back a long time over.
Oh my gosh.
So
Renee,
no, they are very supportive. My son-in-law, I mean, even my dad. I have my whole family out there hawking teas.
love that. That's so fun. That actually sounds like more fun than if you were out there by yourself. Like,
It is, right? It is, and they're always, especially my 9-year-old granddaughter, and my 7-year-old grandson. We did an event last year with a really high end hotel here, and so I took them, my staff, right? They were 11, 9, and 7, right? So I took there with me, and I had them carrying the teas in, and my client just loved them, and she took them on. It's a beautiful, really high end hotel here, and she took them on a tour, and they loved it. And in the end, she's like, "Oh, we got a candy store over here. Have at it." So they think
oh,
work is going on tours. The hard part was they had to bring some boxes in. Then they got to go on a tour, and then they got a bunch of candy, and they're like, "That work is great."
which you know what? That's not a bad mindset to have. I'm not mad at the next generation having that mindset because if we can look at work in a positive way, we can enjoy it so much more.
And when you're 7 and you get in a bunch of candy, you're like, "Whoa, who doesn't wanna work like this?" Right?
Oh my gosh, Renee, this has been such a fun chat. Thank
I
you
had so
so
much
much.
fun. Thank you so
Oh,
much for allowing me to share my experiences. And like I said, please feel free with your audience. The website is www.symphonyofleavestea.com. And if there's any questions in any way I can help you in kind of helping, new small business owners, I am more than happy to share any little tidbits and answer any questions.
oh my goodness, you are such a gem. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us on Bringing Up Business. If you could, please take a moment to subscribe to and rate the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram at bub.podcast. That's BUB.podcast. Finally, we'd love to get your feedback. If you have a comment or a guest idea, please let us know on our website, bringingupbusiness.com. Until next time, thanks for joining us. Say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Say bye-bye. See you later.
Bye-bye, see you later.
This recording is for informational purposes only and should not be considered business advice. Opinions expressed are as of the date of recording and are subject to change without notice. The views and opinions of guests on this program are not necessarily those of Umari Digital and its affiliates, which together we refer to as Umari Digital. Umari Digital is not affiliated with guests or their business affiliates unless otherwise stated. Umari Digital does not guarantee the accuracy or the completeness of the data presented herein. This recording is for informational purposes only, and the information, data, analysis, or opinion it includes or their use should not be considered business, financial, or legal advice. Umari Digital shall not be responsible for any decisions, damages, or other losses resulting from or related to the information, data, analysis, or opinions, or their use. All business decisions are subject to risk, including possible loss of capital. Individuals should seriously consider if a decision is suitable for them by referencing their own financial position. Thank you.